Hello, anatomy friends. This is Dr. Alsip, and in this learning objective video, we are going to focus on the histology, or that microscopic components of bone tissue. And I know this course is really focused on the gross anatomy, or what we can actually see with the naked eye. But I do think understanding these microscopic structures, in particular the cells that are going to make bone appear the way that they do, are really important in terms of understanding the function of bone. So let's spend a little bit of time here before we move on to some of the more gross anatomy. And we have a lot to get through. We have quite a few learning objectives here. I do highly recommend that after you review this video and kind of taken notes, to come back to these learning objectives and see if you can answer these in your own words. I think that's a highly valuable way of understanding this material. All right, so there are four major cells, bony cells. And we're going to start with the stem cell, or these osteogenic, or sometimes you hear these referred to as osteoprogenitor stem cells. And these are stem cells. These are the bone's stem cells, and they will be derived from mesenchyme. And mesenchyme is going to be the embryonic tissue by which all or almost all connective tissues form. And bone is a type of connective tissue, so it makes sense that it will form through this mesenchyme. And these stem cells, or these osteogenic cells, are the only bone cells that are capable of cell division. The other three that we're going to talk about are not capable of cell division, only osteogenic cells. And once these cells are ready to begin to secrete extracellular matrix, the name will actually change to osteoblasts, which is the second type of bone cell. So we'll talk more about that in a moment. But before we move on from that, I do want to note that these osteogenic cells are located all over the place in terms of the bone. In particular, these are going to be located on that deep side, or the inner portion of the periosteum, so that connective tissue that's surrounding the bone, or the outer portion of the bone. These osteogenic cells will also be found within the endosteum. And then also importantly, these will be found within neurovascular canals. So located in numerous different regions, really important to have it kind of all over the place, because it is going to eventually transition into osteoblasts. So it develops into osteoblast cells. So we keep talking about osteoblasts. So what are these? So osteoblasts are, simply put, these are really these bone building cells. And you can kind of remember the function of the osteoblasts because it has the B in it. Osteoblasts will build bone. And how it does this is it actually will synthesize and secrete the organic components of the extracellular matrix. So you are going to have these collagen fibers that are secreted by the osteoblasts, and collagen fibers are the majority portion of the organic components of the extracellular matrix. And you have to have this organic framework of the extracellular matrix in order to initiate calcification. And calcification really just means the hardening of bone. So you will have to have that meshwork of that organic material in order for the inorganic mineral salts to really move into the region and begin to harden. And so it will secrete this extracellular matrix, and it will continually surround itself by that extracellular matrix that it's secreting. And once it's kind of completely surrounded itself by the extracellular matrix, and it's really kind of done secreting the extracellular matrix, it will actually transition at that point into what's referred to as an osteocyte. But before we talk about osteocytes, I do want to talk a little bit more about the extracellular matrix, because it's hugely important in terms of understanding what bone actually will look like. So recall that extracellular matrix is that material that is going to be located between cells. And in the case of bone, those cells are really widely separated. So you have these cells kind of interspersed throughout, and then you'll have the extracellular matrix in between. So if you're looking kind of at these pictures here, these are kind of the cells. And then everything in between here, that's all extracellular matrix. And it's really the structure of the extracellular matrix that determines much of that tissue's quality. So say, for example, if we were talking about cartilage, the extracellular matrix is firm, but it's more pliable or flexible than what you have with bone. The extracellular matrix of bone is going to be much harder with a little bit of flexibility. So really plays a big role in terms of the function of the tissues. Now, the major components of the bone extracellular matrix are going to be water. Water's in everything. You're going to have organic material, and of the organic materials, really collagen fibers are the major component. And then you're going to also have inorganic material, which are going to be crystallized or hardened mineral salts. So when we're talking about the mineral salts, the most abundant of those is going to be calcium phosphate, with calcium hydroxide as kind of the second, and you kind of put those together. You're going to form these crystals or hydroxyapatite, which I don't want you to worry about memorizing this chemical formula. I just have it up here because it's cool, or in case you have an interest in these chemical formulae. And this hydroxyapatite is going to combine with other mineral salts and ions that will be deposited within the organic framework of those collagen fibers. So you'll have kind of collagen fibers throughout, and then you'll have that inorganic material kind of surrounding or interweaving between the organic materials. And eventually that inorganic material will harden, and that's where you'll get that hardness associated with bone. It's important to note that you have to have that both the organic as well as the inorganic materials for that process of calcification or hardening to occur. Now, as mentioned, that hardness of the bone is going to be based on the inorganic tissues, inorganic material, and that flexibility is going to be due to the collagen fiber. And I know it sounds kind of pathological to think of a bone being flexible, but you do need some form of flexibility in order to have that tensile strength or that resistance of really being stretched or torn apart. If you don't have any flexibility or any organic material, or kind of you don't have the proper amount of the organic material, you can have what's referred to as brittle bone. And that is much more likely to kind of shatter or have certain fractures associated with it. So if you don't have enough collagen fibers, that can be pathological. If you don't have enough hardness associated with the inorganic tissue, that can lead to over flexibility. And really, you can actually do your own kind of science experiment if trying to kind of visualize this. So you can soak a bone in something acidic, something as simple as vinegar, and that will actually dissolve the mineral salts associated with bone. And that just leaves that organic collagen fibers, and you get this really flexible, almost rubbery type of composition of the bone. So you really have to have that correct balance of the organic as well as the inorganic components of the extracellular matrix to have a fully functioning or properly functioning bone. Now let's return to the cells of bone tissue. Recall that those osteoblasts are going to start secreting that organic component of the extracellular matrix. It will surround itself with that extracellular matrix. And then once it's done so, it's kind of trapped itself within the extracellular matrix, then the name will transition to an osteocyte, which has a different function, mainly in terms of maintenance of the daily metabolism of bone. Now, it's important to note that an osteocyte is not dead. So it trapped itself, but it's still doing things in there. They're very much functioning in terms of passing nutrients as well as chemical signals. This is important to one another via gap junctions. They also are going to pass metabolic waste to the nearest blood vessel for disposal. So lots going on in the osteocyte. So very much a functioning cell. You can see that these cells have these large processes, which will allow communication to far-reaching osteocytes. So osteocytes located in different areas, as well as sometimes osteoblasts as well. So when you look at a textbook definition of an osteocyte, you really see the maintenance of the daily metabolism. But I do want to kind of point out some recent research, or more recent research, focusing on the role of the osteocytes as a strain sensor. That will basically, it's kind of a mechanosensor that allows control of the adaptive responses to mechanical loading on bone. So if there's too much going on in terms of stress on a bone or not enough, it's going to utilize hormonal or mechanical signals in regulation of bone mass. So it actually plays a hugely important role in terms of that maintenance and communication with other cells. So really super cool newer research regarding osteocytes. It's generally, I remember when I was learning about it, I thought it was the more boring of the bone cells, but it really plays a very functionally important role as well. The fourth bone cell, or the last bone cell, is a big one, both literally as well as figuratively, and this is called an osteoclast. And clast means to break down, or you can memorize it as osteoclasts with the C, will consume or break down that extracellular matrix. And I know at first blush, again, thinking about breaking down bone actually sounds pretty pathological, but it's part of the daily maintenance of bone, as long as it's going along at the same pace as bone building that occurs with osteoblasts. Now, whereas those other three cells that we talked about were part of an overall cell life cycle, osteoclasts kind of come from its own place. These are going to be formed by the fusion of monocytes, which are a type of white blood cell. And so it'll be the fusion of numerous monocytes, and thus we have this fairly large, or comparatively larger cell, which is the osteoclasts. Osteoclasts also have this very distinctive ruffled border, which will always be bone facing. And when it is going to be signaled to do so, it will allow lysosomes and other acids to be released and actually break down the extracellular matrix of bone as part of, hopefully, normal functioning. It also plays a really important role in terms of increasing blood calcium levels when needed. So blood calcium is hugely important in terms of functioning of other organs and other tissues. So sometimes you do need to increase that blood calcium level. And we'll talk about a bit more about that balance between bone building and bone breakdown in an upcoming video. All right, so a quick review here. Osteogenic cells are going to be those bone stem cells. They will eventually begin to secrete extracellular matrix, and at that time these are referred to as an osteoblast. An osteoblast will surround itself by the extracellular matrix that it is going to secrete, and once it has done so, then it becomes an osteocyte. Very important in terms of maintenance of bone tissue, very important in terms of understanding the mechanical load that's associated with the bone. So these are part of a life cycle of a cell, whereas these osteoclasts are off doing their own thing. These are going to be formed by the fusion of numerous monocytes, and very important in terms of bone resorption or bone breakdown. All right, so those are those four bone cells. And as always, this is question time, and I want you to try to answer this question without referring back to your notes. So pause the video. And when you're ready, I do hope that you unpause the video and we'll talk about which cell associated with osseous tissue is going to play the largest role in bone resorption or bone breakdown. And hopefully you have landed on B, the osteoclasts, being the correct answer. Osteoclasts are not part of this normal cell cycle here, but very important in terms of bone breakdown. Osteoblasts are going to be the bone builders. So that is kind of that opposite action. So osteoblasts are not right. Osteocytes are those mature bone cells. so not playing a role in terms of bone resorption or the actual action or the secretion of materials that will allow that to happen. So osteocytes is not right, and osteogenic cells are these bone stem cells capable of cell division that will form into those osteoblasts. All right, excellent. Thank you so much for your time and attention here. Do make sure that you are comfortable with these concepts covered in this video. These concepts really are going to be building blocks to understand some of the concepts we talk about in upcoming videos. So make sure you're feeling comfortable here before you move on. All right, thank you for your time, and I will see you in the next video.